The warmth of the fireplace did little to chase away the chill that crept down my spine as Marianne's piercing gaze fell upon me. "Well, Avery, dear, I must say that dress is interesting," she said, her ruby-red lips curling into a smile that never reached her eyes. I forced a polite grin, my cheeks flushing. "Thank you, Marianne. It's one of my favorites." "I can see why." Elliot's mother gave a tinkling laugh that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "So bold and unique, just like you. Although I do wonder if it's quite appropriate for this family dinner." My mouth went dry as I looked at Elliot, silently pleading for him to intervene. But he just stared down at his plate, shoulders tense. "You know how much we value tradition in this household," Marianne continued, her syrupy tone a sharp contrast to the barbs in her words. "We wouldn't want to make anyone uncomfortable." The room seemed to shrink around me as the rest of the family remained silent observers. My vision blurred with unshed tears that I blinked back furiously. This was supposed to be a warm welcome into the Halden family after my marriage to Elliot. Instead, I felt like an ill-fitting pawn being scrutinized. "Of course, Mother," I choked out. "I'll be more mindful next time." "Wonderful." She clapped her hands together delicately. "Now, why don't you tell us a bit more about yourself, dear? We're just dying to get to know you better." I opened my mouth, but the words stuck in my throat as her cold eyes bored into me. In that moment, I realized this was about more than just my dress choice. This was Marianne establishing her dominance, a chilling power play that left me disoriented. Some distant part of me registered the uncomfortable silence stretching on until Elliot cleared his throat. "Actually, Mother, I think that's enough for tonight. Avery's had a long day." The rabbit hole didn't seem to end as the weeks ticked by in our new home. If anything, Marianne's needling demands only escalated, from explicit instructions on how to properly set the dinner table to casual comments belittling my career ambitions. And Elliot, my once loving husband, simply watched in silence as his mother's barbs chipped away at my sense of self piece by piece. It became a dizzying cycle of appeasing Marianne's every whim, lest I face the consequences of her wrath through icy rebukes or underhanded reminders of how I was an outsider here. But it was the disappointed looks from Elliot that cut deepest, each one another jagged crack spreading across the dream I had for our marriage. In those early days of our new life together, I was drowning, gasping for air in a twisted game I didn't know the rules to, and Marianne seemed determined to keep me unbalanced through her sinister passive aggression, all while wearing a sickly sweet smile, of course, because that was the Halden family way. At first, the changes in Elliot were so subtle, I easily chalked them up to the stress of starting our new life together. A forgotten birthday here, a canceled date night there, small things that I excused as just part of getting into a new groove as newlyweds. But soon, those slight oversights spiraled into something darker, something that made my heart clench every time I saw the disappointment and disdain hardening in his eyes. "This pot roast is dry as a bone," he grumbled one night, jabbing his fork moodily into the meat. "Honestly, Avery, how many times do I have to show you?" I opened my mouth, then snapped it shut as Marianne swept into the dining room. Now, Elliot, that's no way to speak to your wife." Her nostrils flared as she pinned me with an icy stare, although Avery should know better by now. The lump in my throat threatened to choke me as I looked at Elliot pleadingly, desperate for him to defend me like he used to. But he just shrugged, already shoveling another forkful of the dry pot roast into his mouth. That night was only the beginning. Pretty soon, Elliot's callous comments became as commonplace as Marianne's constant critiques of my abilities as a wife and daughter-in-law. He'd track Mud into the house and then snap at me for not anticipating his needs. I'd burn dinner, and he'd throw the plate across the kitchen in a rage. All the while, Marianne watched like a hawk, her curved lips stretching into a satisfied smile every time Elliot willingly played his role. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks one afternoon when I foolishly asked Elliot if he wanted to grab lunch together before his next meeting. "Don't be ridiculous," he scoffed, already shrugging on his suit jacket. "You know Mother prefers I'm back promptly after appointments to discuss business matters." My heart plummeted into my stomach as I watched him hurry out the door, not even a backward glance in my direction. That's when the harsh truth finally clicked into place. Marianne had enveloped us so fully in her twisted web that Elliot was utterly beholden to her every rule. My husband was a shell of his former self, his love for me dulled by years of psychological conditioning at his mother's hand, and I was slowly being suffocated by her ruthless control over our family, gasping for air in a life I no longer recognized. "Oh, Avery, you're pouting again." Marianne's sickly sweet voice rang out from behind me. I spun around, jaw clenched, as she sicked loudly and shook her head. "When will you learn?" In that moment, something inside me twisted and snapped. I could no longer swallow down the bitter truth. If I stayed on this path, Marianne would grind me into the dirt until I was a vacant, submissive shadow of my former self. Just like Elliot. No, that was not the life I wanted. Not for me. Not for anyone. And as I met her cold gaze steadily, a new flame of determination was lit from the dying embers inside me. If Marianne wanted a battle, she would get one, with everything I had, because this time I would be the one calling the shots. The annual Halden Family Charity Gala was supposed to be a lighthearted affair, a chance for the town's elite to mingle and pat themselves on the back over champagne and hors d'oeuvres. But this year would be different. This year, I had a plan. As I descended the staircase in my crisp azure gown, clutching Elliot's arm, I saw Marianne's eyes narrow ever so slightly. Her well-practiced smile wavered just for an instant before settling back into that familiar saccharine mask. "Why, Avery? You clean up nicely," she purred as we reached the bottom of the stairs. "Although I do wish you'd done something a bit more sophisticated with your hair." My grip on Elliot's arm tightened, but he remained stoically impassive, refusing to even look at me, just like I knew he would. The night blazed on in a whirlwind of fake laughter and insincere compliments that made my skin crawl. I smiled woodenly, one hand clutching my champagne flute like a lifeline, as Marianne's barbs continued unchecked. "It really is too bad you never finished your college degree, dear," she said loudly during Aovek, her voice carrying across the crowded ballroom. We Haldens do so value a prestigious education. A hush fell over our little group as I felt dozens of eyes boring into me, awaiting my stuttered excuse like they'd grown accustomed to over the years. But not this time. This time, the anger roaring in my ears drowned out any shred of remaining intimidation. "Actually, Marianne, I seem to recall you dropping out as well," I said coolly, taking a dainty sip of my champagne. "To start a family, was it?" Her perfectly lined lips parted in shock as hushed murmurs began rippling through our audience. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of Elliot's father, Douglas, suppressing a grin before Marianne's voice sliced through the tension again. "Well, I never. You'd do well to watch your tone, young lady," she hissed, color blooming high on her cheeks. "I've half a mind to." "To what, Marianne?" I cut her off, something inside me finally snapping free. "Continue your sad attempts to belittle and control me? Save your breath, because I'm simply done playing your twisted little games." I leveled my gaze at Elliot, who shrank back, a deer in the headlights. "Or has your mother not told you about her plans to remove me from your lives? To wipe me from the picture completely so she can find you a more suitable bride to further the Halden legacy?" An icy silence hung in the air, punctuated only by Marianne's ragged breathing as her mask shattered completely. I could taste the fear rolling off her in dizzying waves, smell the acrid stench of her desperation. The crowd seemed to sway around me as I looked from Elliot's pale, stricken face to Marianne, and then to Douglas, the first inkling of hope in his eyes for longer than I could remember. With a sickening lurch, the weight of my entrapment these past few years finally hit me like a physical blow. The lies, the belittling, the silent torment, all at the hands of this vile woman and her puppet of a son. Something inside me finally broke free as the last threads of fear dissolved away, replaced by a calmness I hadn't felt in years. A foreign power seemed to uncurl within me, urging me not to flee this time, but to stand my ground. To fight. The whispers were growing louder now, but I barely heard them over the roaring in my ears as I tossed back the last of my champagne and smiled at Marianne. "No, I'm afraid the games are just beginning." The deafening silence that followed my outburst at the gala was finally broken by the harsh clack of Marianne's heels as she stormed away, her face twisted into a mask of rage. Elliot trailed after her, throwing me one last haunted look before disappearing into the crowd. I stood rooted to the spot, my heart thundering in my ears as the world slowly bled back into focus. Hushed whispers and scandalized gasps swirled around me, but I barely registered them over the chorus of voices in my mind. What had I done? After years of keeping my head down, something had snapped inside of me in that heated moment. An overwhelming urge to shatter the heavy silence, to unravel this twisted tapestry Marianne had woven around our family. Trembling, I turned to Douglas, the first man I'd ever seen stand up to his domineering wife. He placed a wizened hand on my arm, his eyes shining with the first hint of resolve I'd witnessed in years. "You did the right thing, Avery," he murmured gruffly. "The truth had to come out, no matter how ugly." His earnest words should have been a balm, helping ease the searing guilt and shock pulsing through my veins. But they did little to chase away the nagging sense of dread coiling in the pit of my stomach, because I knew this was only the beginning. My grand public outburst may have rattled Marianne's cage, but the real fallout was yet to come. She would retaliate, of that I was certain, which meant I needed to be prepared to fight back with everything I had. That realization was what finally spurred me into action over the next few days, as the harsh condemnations and scandalized whispers engulfed our family. While Elliot holed up in his study in a drunken stupor, I began to gather what little evidence I could. Damning financial statements, detailing the misappropriation of Halden family funds, sworn affidavits from Marianne's hired staff recounting her unhinged verbal tirades, a trove of secret recordings spanning years, each one more incriminating than the last. I compiled my case meticulously, letting the smoldering embers of my anger drive me forward as I prepared for the battle to come. Because one thing had become painfully clear. Marianne would stop at nothing to regain control over her kingdom, and I would be her prime target. The breaking point came one night after another of Elliot's inevitable blow-ups, his voice hoarse from screaming about the humiliation I'd brought upon this family. I had hidden in the pantry, my breath coming in raggedy pants as his venomous words hit their mark again and again, until finally I heard the telltale click of Marianne's heels against the hardwood and the murmur of their hushed conversation filtering through the cracked door. "Get rid of her." Marianne's low, steely voice made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "She's become much too unruly, much too dangerous to our family's interests." Unable to contain myself a moment longer, I leaned in closer until their poisonous whispers became clear as day. And that's when I heard the evidence I'd been subconsciously seeking all along. The final, damning confession that any shed of humanity had long been snuffed out in this family. The gloves were off. The time for playing Marianne's twisted games was over, because now it was my turn to fight fire with fire. As the whispered threats from Marianne and Elliot's hushed confession echoed in my mind, a strange calmness washed over me. No more walking on eggshells, no more forcing smiles as I was pecked apart from the inside. This was war, and I would be ready. The next morning, I awoke before dawn and quietly slipped out of the house before Elliot or Marianne could stir. My footsteps were the only sound on the deserted downtown streets as I made my way to the one place I knew I could find allies, Everly's Diner. The tinkling of the bell above the door was like a soothing balm as the familiar scents of bacon and freshly brewed coffee enveloped me. This place had been my haven in those first few strained years of marriage, when I could still escape Marianne's clutches for a few blessed hours. "Well, if it isn't my favorite customer!" Janice, the owner, emerged from the kitchen, a hesitant smile playing across her lips, as she took in my undoubtedly haggard appearance. "Rough night, hon? You could say that." The words were already tumbling out before I could stop them. The revelations at the gala, the whispered threats, my finally reaching the breaking point. As I spilled everything, I watched Janice's eyes widen, one wrinkled hand flying to cover her mouth. "Oh, darlin', I always knew that woman was nothin' but a snake," she muttered, shaking her head slowly. "But to go that far, to actually try hurting you like that, that's a new low, even for her." An unexpected surge of relief coursed through me at her words, as if finally hearing someone else validate my pain and experiences made it all just a little more bearable. I opened my mouth, about to try explaining myself further when the bell above the door jangled again. "There you are." A familiar voice rang out as Lila, my best friend from college, rushed over and enveloped me in a bone-crushing hug. "Janice called and told me everything. Avery, I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you all this time. If I'd known what was really going on." Her voice cracked with emotion, and I instinctively tightened my arms around her. Lila had been the closest thing to family I had in those first few years of my marriage before Marianne's isolating tactics finally pushed her away. "You're here now," I murmured, forcing a watery smile as she finally pulled back. "That's what matters." "Damn straight." Lila swiped away the tears trickling down her cheeks before squaring her shoulders determinedly. "So what's the plan, Av? How can I help take that bitch down?" My lips twitched in a real smile this time at the fierce protectiveness blazing in her eyes. Because that's exactly what I needed now, someone with claws out who was ready to fight. "Well, for starters, I need to gather more evidence," I began, the gears in my mind already turning. "Anything I can use to expose Marianne and get these people off my back once and for all." I was thinking... "You were thinking it's time to play a little hardball," a new voice cut me off. I turned to see Charlie, my friend Lila's older brother, and a hotshot corporate lawyer, sweeping into the diner. A slow grin spread across his face as he took in my questioning look. "Leela called me from the road," he explained with a shrug. "Said my brilliant college pal was finally ready to stand up for herself. So," he rubbed his hands together, "what kind of trouble are we stirring up?" As I laid out the pieces I'd gathered so far, I could feel the weight temporarily lifting from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I wasn't alone in this fight. I finally had people, friends, in my corner who were ready to go to battle. No more passive silence, no more turning the other cheek as Marianne and her minions sought to drown me. This time, I would be the one putting up a fight. This time, the predators would become the prey. The next few weeks flew by in a whirlwind of clandestine meetings and furtive evidence gathering as Lila, Charlie, and I built an airtight case against Marianne and her web of deceit. Papers were meticulously organized into binders. Undercover surveillance captured hushed confrontations and damning admissions. A steely sense of determination took root inside me, unfurling with each incriminating piece we unearthed. By the time the annual Halden Hospitality Charity Gala arrived, I could feel the palpable tension thrumming through my veins. This would be the moment of truth, the culmination of weeks of secret planning, my chance to cut through the smothering silence once and for all. "You've got this, Lila murmured as we did final checks in the courthouse bathroom. Her fingers deftly fluffed my hair as her gaze met mine in the mirror, a silent message passing between us. No more fear, no more games. When we emerged into the marbled lobby a few minutes later, the gilded ballroom was already buzzing with Woodbrook's elite in their tuxedoed finery. Champagne flutes glinted under the soft candlelight as mingled laughter and chatter filled the air. I could feel hundreds of eyes trailing over me as I deliberately wove through the crowd, clutching the overflowing case binder to my chest like a shield. A hush seemed to fell over the crowd with each step, until finally I reached the center of the polished dance floor. "Good evening, everyone," I said in a clear, ringing voice, flashing them all a brilliant smile. "I'd like to take a moment to celebrate the generous philanthropists in our community who have gone to such great lengths to give back." A smattering of hesitant applause followed along with a few bewildered looks. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched Marianne stiffen, the color draining from her perfectly made-up face. "Of course," I continued lightly, "there are a few individuals here tonight who have been rather generous with their philanthropy, shall we say." As I spoke, I deposited the binder on a nearby table with a dull thud and began paging through the damning evidence. Embezzling funds from local charities and family trusts to fuel lavish lifestyles and keep up appearances, betraying the trust and confidence of those who believed in their philanthropic integrity. My voice remained maddeningly calm, even as Marianne's face contorted with rage and panic flickered in Elliot's eyes. As more and more details tumbled from my lips, a deafening silence fell over the crowd, broken only by the flutter of papers and my inexorable narration. "Then, of course, we have the less legal dalliances to account for as well." I leveled my gaze squarely at Elliot now, holding up glossy photographic proof of his indiscretions for all to see. Cavorting with strange women, deceiving his faithful wife, all while hiding behind this thin veneer of community-minded chivalry. The hushed gasps of shock seemed to reverberate against the vaulted ceilings now, shattered only by the guttural scream that finally tore free from Marianne's throat. Wild-eyed and trembling, she looked every bit the caged animal as security began closing in from all sides. In that crystalline moment of reckoning, I could see the final shreds of her meticulously constructed facade disintegrating into ash right before me. There would be no more lies, no more manipulations under the guise of propriety. For the first time since she'd callously destroyed my naive dreams of familial belonging all those years ago, I felt a savage sense of victory coursing through my veins unfettered. The karmic wheel had finally turned, and Marianne was powerless to stop it. As two burly guards moved to apprehend her, Marianne's gaze found mine one final time, feral and burning with hatred. But this time her venom held no power, sliding harmlessly away as the last of the fear dissolved inside me, because in that moment I was the master of her supposed checkmate. The thunderous silence that followed Marianne's dramatic arrest seemed to stretch into eternity. I could taste the collective shock and disbelief like a palpable force as the once venerable Halden family imploded before their eyes. For a fleeting moment, Elliot and I locked gazes across the ballroom floor. His expression was utterly inscrutable, eyes hollow and glazed as twin trails of moisture streaked his ashen cheeks. Then, just as quickly as the spell had woven between us, it shattered, splintering into 1,000 unspoken recriminations and shards of dashed hopes. Elliot's jaw hardened and he turned on his heel, retreating into the claustrophobic crowd as if I were the villain here, as if I had been the jackal systematically stripping our family apart, piece by piece. The bitter taste of defeat nearly choked me until a warm hand came to rest on my shoulder. I turned to see Douglas, the shrunken shell of a man suddenly seeming decades older than his years. "You did what you had to do," he murmured, his words barely audible over the rising din of panicked murmuring. "She left you no choice." A knot I didn't realize I'd been carrying seemed to loosen ever so slightly at his reassurance. For so long, he had been just another one of Marianne's puppets, helpless against the manipulations of his monstrous wife. But now, in the wake of this cataclysmic shake-up, I could see the first faint flickers of hope rekindling in his rheumy eyes. The iron manacles were finally loosening. "For what it's worth, I'm sorrier than you'll ever know," Douglas continued hoarsely, gnarled fingers tightening around my arm in a vice grip. "Marianne, she was always the strong one, the immovable force, and I let myself become malleable, too cowed to ever stand up to her toxic ways until it was far too late." His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, face etched with regret. "You didn't deserve any of what she put you through, Avery. But maybe now, maybe there's a chance to start fresh." I could only nod numbly, too overwhelmed to find any words of forgiveness or comfort. Because in that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of his shattered legacy, Douglas was beyond consoling. No, there would be no easy path forward now, not for any of us. The Halden family as we'd known it was irreparably broken, the bedrock foundation built on lies and deceit. As the gaping crowd parted like the Red Sea, Marianne reappeared between her two hulking security escorts. No longer the impeccably coiffed ice queen, her coppery hair askew and mascara streaking her crimson cheeks in muddy rivulets. But her slate eyes still gleamed with that familiar vindictive light as they bored into me. "You ungrateful, malicious little cur," she spat, the haunting words cutting through the silent ballroom. "After everything I sacrificed for this family, gave you people so you could keep living in your pathetic delusions of grandeur." One of the guards made a move to silence her, but Marianne merely wrenched free, her lips peeling back in a manic snarl. "Don't think this is over. You hear me, Avery? I'll make you regret the day you ever set foot in this town and tried to sully the Halden name." Her vicious threats hung in the air like a dark miasma as I watched the sad, broken remnants of her once imperious persona be dragged away. No, this was far from over, I realized with a chill. Marianne's stubborn claws would remain sunk in deep, poisoning any chance at peaceful resolution until her dying breath. As the ballroom seemed to gradually swirl back into motion around me, The first tangled threads of uncertainty began weaving their way through my momentary vindication. Because one thing had become resoundingly clear: there would be no clean slates here. No easy path to redemption or letting go of the past. Not when it came to the deep, soul-scarring rift Marianne had rent into our fractured family. The only path forward now was to finish what I'd started, no matter how ugly the finale. The months following the cataclysmic unraveling of the Halden family legacy were a cyclonic blur. Attorneys, court appearances, endless hearings, it all bled together into a surreal waking dream as I weathered the fallout. True to her malicious vow, Marianne fought tooth and nail against the charges, her snarling defiance echoing through oak-paneled courtrooms like the unrelenting screeches of a wild animal. Evidence be damned, she seemed determined to drag us all down into her scorched-earth spiral of destruction before finally admitting defeat. But in the end, the truth proved insurmountable. The house of lies she'd so meticulously constructed came crumbling down in an avalanche of convictions and seized assets. I could only look on in muted triumph as the once untouchable Marianne Halden was led away in shackles, her raging accusations buried under the weight of her own hubris. For Elliot, there could be no easy escape from his silent complicity either. Faced with his own damning trail of evidence, adulterous entanglements, misused funds, illegal business dealings, my husband eventually accepted a plea deal. His sentence was lighter than his mother's, but the cost was steep nonetheless. Public humiliation, hefty fines, and a lifetime of untangling his father's ravaged business affairs. As for Douglas, the tragic patriarch displayed a weariness that went far beyond his years as the curtain closed on this ugliest of family dramas. He retreated from the prying eyes of the community, content to quietly pick up the pieces of his shattered empire alone. Well, not entirely alone, for in a gesture I never could have foreseen, he summoned me to his study one rain-swept evening with an unexpected offering, a shocking sum of restitution and an even more stunning apology. You never deserved the venom my wife unleashed, nor my own cowardice in enabling her toxic behavior, he rasped, calloused fingers caressing a worn photograph of family happier times. But I hope this can be a step towards making amends for the suffering you endured on my watch. I opened my mouth to protest, but Douglas raised a withered hand, his eyes shimmering with a fragile hope. Take it, Avery. For once in your life, take something you never had to fight tooth and nail for. Build yourself a legacy untainted by the rot of this family. His gruff words should have felt like a balm after such harrowing turmoil. And yet, as I accepted the oversized check with trembling hands, my heart felt strangely hollow, because no amount of reckoning or restitution could ever absolve the scars that had been carved into my soul by this once revered family. Those wounds would never fully heal, I realized with a pang of melancholy. Even now, stripped of their wealth and clout, the Haldens maintained an invisible hold over me, their ghosts lingering in the farthest reaches of my psyche, like insidious wraiths. But rather than allowing their toxic legacy to tighten around me once more, I would take Douglas's offering and finally forge my own path forward. So as the weeks and seasons gradually shifted once more, I did just that. Carefully channeling the still smoldering embers of anger simmering within, I began investing and planning, slowly, meticulously building my own empire from the ashes of the old. It started small, just a little community arts program for underprivileged youth that had been a lifelong dream. Then, as my nest egg blossomed into more ambitious ventures, the initiatives multiplied. Before long, I was able to establish a formidable foundation in my own name, dedicated to empowering women who had faced abuse and marginalization at the hands of toxic power structures. With every new achievement and hard-won victory, I could feel the icy grip of the past gradually loosening its hold over my battered soul, the all-consuming rage and thirst for vengeance slowly giving way to a renewed sense of purpose and strength from within. It would be naive to think the scars could ever fully fade, that the haunting specter of Marianne's abuse wouldn't still linger in the darkest recesses of my heart, appearing in my most vulnerable moments like a malevolent phantasm. But now, finally, I had reclaimed the power to exorcise those demons in whatever form they took. The cycle of toxicity had been broken once and for all, replaced by the first blushes of a new day. a day where I was no longer just surviving, but finally thriving as the master of my own rebirth.
I am Sandra, 30 years of age. The latter came true, but the good news is that it brought me a job at a manufacturing company in Chicago after graduating from one of the best universities. I take pride in my accomplishments and being somewhat financially secure, but what good is that when it comes at the cost of a heavy tax on your relationships? This story was straight out of me. A 33-year-old man named Jake who had never been able to fully support himself, let alone Sis. Jake and I have been married for nearly 5 years. We met in college, and while we shared many dreams and ambitions, life hasn't turned out as smoothly as we had hoped. Jake had a promising start with a stable job after graduation, but things took a turn for the worse when he had a conflict with his boss. The clash wasn't entirely Jake's fault. The boss was notorious for being difficult. Still, Jake's decision to quit was a blow to our finances and to his confidence. Since then, finding and keeping a job has been a struggle for him. For the past year, Jake has been job hunting without success. He's tried various part-time jobs, but is quick to quit whenever something doesn't meet his expectations or if he faces a minor conflict. It's as though he's searching for an escape rather than a solution. I've tried to be supportive, understanding that his past experiences might be affecting his job search, but it's wearing me thin. His unemployment is not just a financial burden, it's a strain on our marriage. The turning point came unexpectedly last month. Jake came to me with excitement in his eyes. "Sandra, I've got big news," he said, his tone brimming with enthusiasm. "What's up?" I asked, hoping for something positive. "Well, my parents are celebrating Dad's retirement, and I've decided to take them on a trip to Italy to celebrate. I'm going to use the Freedom credit card," Jake said, mentioning the card I use for work and personal expenses. I was taken aback. "The Freedom credit card, Jake? That's not a small expense." "Have you discussed this with me? No need to worry. It's all sorted. I've already planned the trip and booked the flights," he replied nonchalantly. My heart sank. "Jake, we've talked about our finances. You can't just use the credit card without discussing it first, and considering our current situation, this doesn't seem wise." Jake brushed off my concerns. "It's going to be a great trip. I've got it covered." Days later, I received an alarming call from the credit card company. "Hello, Mrs. Harris. We noticed some unusual activity on your Freedom credit card. It seems there's been an attempt to use it for a transaction that's been declined." My pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What transaction?" The representative explained that the card had been blocked due to suspicious activity and would soon be replaced with a new one. I realized the card Jake used was no longer valid. When Jake came home that evening, I confronted him. "Jake, I need to talk to you about the credit card. It's been blocked." Jake's face went pale. "What? That can't be right. I've already told my parents we're going on this trip. How am I supposed to pay for it?" "Exactly my point. You used my credit card without permission, and now it doesn't work. What's your plan now?" I asked, trying to keep my frustration in check. Jake looked increasingly anxious. "I don't know. I thought it would work." "That's not the issue, Jake. You've repeatedly made decisions without considering the consequences. This is just another example of how your lack of responsibility is affecting us." The next day, I received a call from Olivia, Jake's mother. "Sandra, I'm so sorry about Jake's actions. He told us about the trip, but we had no idea he used your credit card without asking." "It's more than just using the credit card, Olivia," I said, feeling the weight of frustration. "Jake has been struggling with employment and making poor financial decisions. This trip was just the tipping point." Olivia sounded genuinely concerned. We're worried about him too. We thought this trip would be a good distraction, but it seems it's caused more problems. I'll have a talk with him. As I hung up the phone, I realized that this situation wasn't just about the trip or the credit card. It was about the larger pattern of Jake's behavior. He's been avoiding responsibility for so long that it's now affecting every aspect of our lives. Later that evening, Jake came to me with a pained expression. "I know you're upset, Sandra. I should have talked to you first. I just wanted to do something nice for my parents, and I thought it would be a good way to celebrate." "I understand wanting to do something special for your parents," I said, "but the way you handled it was irresponsible. We need to address this issue, not just the trip, but the underlying problem. You've been avoiding your responsibilities for too long." Jake looked at me with pleading eyes. "What are you saying, Sandra?" I took a deep breath. "Jake, I think we need to talk about our future. This pattern of behavior is not sustainable. We need to find a solution before it's too late." As I spoke, I felt a sense of dread. The weight of our issues felt heavier than ever. I knew this conversation would be a turning point, but I wasn't sure how it would end. All I knew was that we were at a critical juncture in our marriage, and something had to change. After that conversation with Jake, things felt more strained than ever. It was clear that the issues between us were deeper than just a financial misstep. The trip to Italy was merely a symptom of a much larger problem: Jake's persistent irresponsibility and my growing frustration with it. Over the next few days, Jake's demeanor was subdued, and he avoided talking about the trip. I tried to keep things as normal as possible, but the tension in our home was palpable. I focused on work, hoping that immersing myself in my responsibilities would provide some relief from the stress at home, but every day the weight of Jake's behavior felt heavier. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Jake walked in looking more anxious than usual. "Sandra, we need to talk," he said, his voice shaky. I put down the spatula and nodded. "All right, what's on your mind?" "I've been thinking about what you said," Jake began, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. "Maybe I should look into getting some financial counseling or career advice. I know I haven't been handling things well." I could see the effort he was making, and part of me wanted to believe that he was finally taking responsibility. "That's a start, Jake, but it's not just about seeking help. It's about changing your approach and making a commitment to it." "I know," he said, sounding more honest. "I've also decided to cancel the trip to Italy. I spoke to my parents, and they understand the situation. I'll figure out another way to make it up to them." While I was relieved that he canceled the trip, a nagging concern remained. Jake's tendency to make promises without following through was troubling. I needed more than words. I needed to see real change. A few days later, I got a call from Olivia, Jake's mother. "Sandra, I just wanted to check in and see how things are going. I heard Jake canceled the trip, and I wanted to offer my support." "Thank you, Olivia," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's been a rough few days. I'm glad Jake decided to cancel the trip, but the issues between us go beyond that. We need to address the bigger picture." "I understand," Olivia said sympathetically. "Jake has always struggled with responsibility. I'm afraid his father and I have tried to help, but it seems like he's got to find his own way." Our conversation ended on a somber note, with Olivia expressing her concern, but also acknowledging that Jake needed to take more responsibility for his actions. I appreciated her support, but knew that the real work lay ahead. As the days turned into weeks, Jake's behavior showed slight improvement. He started attending job interviews and sought out career counseling, as he had promised. However, old habits were hard to break. He still seemed to lack the motivation and follow-through needed to secure a stable job. One night, as we sat together in our living room, I decided to address the issue directly. "Jake, I see you're making an effort, but it feels like we're stuck in a cycle. You make promises, but then things don't change. What's really going on?" Jake sighed deeply, looking away. "I know I've let you down. I'm trying, but it's hard to stay motivated when I keep facing rejection. I feel like a failure." His confession was raw and painful. I understood the emotional toll of constant rejection, but I also knew that our situation couldn't improve without real, tangible changes. "Jake, I get that it's tough, but we need more than just trying. We need a clear plan and commitment to seeing it through. I can't carry this burden alone." Jake nodded slowly, but there was a sadness in his eyes that worried me. "I'll try harder, Sandra. I don't want to lose you." His words were hopeful, but my doubts remained. I needed to see consistent effort and results, not just promises. The situation felt like a fragile balance, teetering on the edge of a precipice. As the weeks continued, I found myself increasingly questioning our future. I wanted to believe in Jake's potential for change, but every failed job search and half-hearted effort made it harder to stay optimistic. The strain on our marriage was taking a toll on my well-being. One evening, as I sat alone in the quiet of our apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were reaching a breaking point. I had hoped that Jake's recent attempts would lead to real change, but the ongoing pattern of disappointment was wearing me thin. I knew that a crucial decision lay ahead. The future of our marriage depended on whether Jake could truly change, or if I would have to face the reality that our relationship might be beyond repair. The weight of uncertainty was almost unbearable, but I had to confront it. I needed to find a way forward, even if it meant making the hardest decision of my life. The situation came to a head sooner than I had anticipated. Despite Jake's best efforts, things were not improving as quickly as I had hoped. The financial strain continued to weigh heavily on us, and his ongoing job struggles seemed to drain the last bit of patience I had. Then one evening, Jake came home with an excited look on his face. "Sandra, I've got great news," he announced almost breathlessly. I set down the book I was reading, bracing myself. "What's the news, Jake?" "I've decided to take my parents on a trip to Italy," he said, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "It'll be a great way to celebrate their retirement. I've already booked everything." I stared at him, stunned. "Jake, what do you mean? We haven't talked about this, and you didn't consult me. How are we even going to afford this?" Jake's expression faltered. "I used your Freedom credit card. I thought it would be a nice surprise." My heart sank. "You used my credit card without asking me? Jake, do you realize how irresponsible that is? We've been struggling with finances, and now you've committed us to an expense we can't afford." Jake's face reddened. "I just wanted to do something nice for my parents. I didn't think it would be a big deal." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's not just about the trip, Jake. It's about your repeated lack of responsibility. We've talked about this before. You can't just make decisions like this without considering the consequences." Jake's shoulders slumped. "I didn't mean to upset you. I thought I was doing something good." I shook my head, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. The issue is not just the trip. It's the pattern of behavior that's been damaging our marriage. You make decisions without consulting me, and then I'm left to deal with the fallout. Later that evening, as I sat alone in the quiet of our living room, I felt a wave of hopelessness. I had tried to be patient and supportive, but Jake's continued irresponsibility was pushing me to the edge. The situation was becoming unbearable. The next morning, Jake's mother, Olivia, called me. Sandra, I just wanted to apologize for Jake's actions. I know he shouldn't have used your credit card without asking. Thank you, Olivia, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. I appreciate your concern, but this situation has been ongoing for a long time. Jake's behavior is affecting our marriage, and I'm at a breaking point. I understand, Olivia replied. We've tried to help Jake, but it seems like he's got to make these changes on his own. We're here to support you both in any way we can. The conversation left me feeling more determined than ever. Jake's actions had pushed me to reconsider our future. It was clear that the pattern of irresponsibility was not something that could be easily fixed. I needed to make a decision about our marriage, and the time had come to face that reality. That evening, I sat down with Jake. We need to talk, I began, my voice steady but firm. I've been patient and I've tried to support you, but your actions have made it clear that we have a serious problem we need to address now. Jake looked at me with a mix of worry and confusion. What are you saying? I can't continue like this, I said, feeling a lump in my throat. I've reached a point where I have to consider what's best for both of us. Your repeated lack of responsibility and the strain it's putting on our marriage has reached a critical point. Jake's face fell, and I could see the realization dawning on him. He had been given countless chances, but the pattern of behavior remained unchanged. The next steps in our relationship would determine the future, but I knew that something had to give. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air, and as I looked at Jake, I realized that the future of our marriage was now hanging in the balance. The days following our confrontation were tense and filled with uncertainty. Jake was clearly distraught by our conversation, and the weight of what had transpired began to sink in. The night after our talk, he sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the floor. The room was heavy with unspoken words, and I knew we had reached a turning point. The next morning, Jake's mother, Olivia, called me again. Sandra, I wanted to talk to you about the situation, she said, her voice tinged with concern. Jake is devastated. He's been struggling, and I think he's finally starting to realize the impact of his actions. I understand, Olivia, I replied, my voice tired but resolute. But I've reached a point where I have to think about my own well-being. This isn't just about Jake anymore. It's about the life I need to lead for myself. Later that day, Jake came to me with a look of resignation. Sandra, I've been thinking about what you said. I realize I've made a mess of things, and I don't want to keep dragging you down. I could see the sincerity in his eyes, but the damage was already done. Jake, I've given this a lot of thought. I need to focus on myself now. The stress and disappointment from your actions have taken a toll on me, and I can't continue living like this. Jake nodded, his face a mix of sadness and acceptance. I understand. I've been given so many chances, and I haven't taken responsibility. I guess this is what I've brought on myself. It was a painful realization, but it was the right decision for both of us. The following days were a whirlwind of legal paperwork and discussions with our families. My decision to file for divorce was final, and I hoped that this step would lead to a more stable and fulfilling life for both of us. When the divorce was finalized, a wave of relief washed over me. I felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. The constant stress and uncertainty were gone, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of freedom. My life was no longer overshadowed by Jake's irresponsibility, and I could focus on my own happiness and well-being. Jake, meanwhile, faced the consequences of his actions without the support he had been used to. He was left to navigate his own path. I hoped that this would prompt him to take the responsibility he had long avoided, but I knew that was ultimately up to him. As I moved forward, I began to rediscover the joy and freedom that had been obscured by years of stress. My career flourished, and I found comfort in the stability that had once seemed so distant. My friends and family supported me through the transition, and their encouragement helped me rebuild my life. Reflecting on the past, I realized that the end of my marriage, while painful, was also a necessary step toward a better future. The strain of financial and employment issues had taken its toll, but it also highlighted the importance of mutual support and responsibility in a relationship. In the end, the story of my marriage with Jake became a chapter of learning and growth. It taught me the value of standing up for myself and the importance of making difficult decisions for my own well-being. And though the road ahead was uncertain, I felt confident that it was leading me toward a brighter, more fulfilling future. And when I was younger, it was just me and Mom. It was a time when Dad bailed, for all intents and purposes, just some flickering memory. Mom busted her ass, working 2 jobs so we could eat, and I would have every book on my supply list. I was awarded a grant for college, and I left debt-free so many don't today thanks to her sacrifices. Like most of us, bent under the heavy yoke of ambition laced with equal parts fear, I studied business management, because who wants to grow up broke as shit on food bank donations again? I graduated, packed up, and moved to the big city. It was a tough start, living in a cramped apartment and surviving on ramen more nights than I'd like to admit. But I landed a job at a large company, started as a junior, and clawed my way up. Fast forward a few years, and I wasn't just working there. I was running a whole department. It was more than a job, it was my turf, and I made sure everyone who worked with me knew they were valued. You got to lead with respect, I'd say during the training for the newbies. Treat this job like you own it, and soon enough you won't just be part of the team, you'll be leading it. The team was solid, a bunch of good folks. When I got the nod for the department head spot, we hit the local bar to celebrate. It was nothing fancy, just a cozy place where the beer was cold and the laughs were plenty. Here's to Erica, the boss lady. Marco, one of my oldest colleagues, raised his glass high. The others joined in, the clinks of glasses echoing over the buzz of the bar. Thanks, guys. We're all in this together. Here's to kicking more ass and taking names. I shouted over the noise, and the team roared back in approval that night, amid the back slaps and cheers. I noticed him, Jake. He caught me looking and sauntered over with a grin that could knock you off balance. Couldn't help but notice the celebration. "What's the occasion?" he asked, leaning against the bar. "Just a little career boost." "I'm the new head of my department now," I said, trying not to sound too braggy. "That's impressive. Must be a tough gig," he replied, nodding appreciatively. "I'm Jake, by the way." "Erica, nice to meet you, Jake." We got to talking more seriously than I intended that night. Turns out Jake was a financier, knew his way around numbers like I did around project plans. Over the next 6 months, what started as casual dates turned into weekends spent together. Not long after, I was spending more time at his place than my own. He had a killer apartment, high ceilings, a view that made you want to brag about it, and a warmth that my dingy rental couldn't match. One evening, as we were overlooking the city lights from his balcony, Jake turned to me, a serious look washing over his usually playful face. He took my hands in his, and I could feel the nervous energy vibrating through them. "Erica, these past months with you have been the best of my life. I know this might seem fast, but when you just know, right?" He started, his voice a mix of certainty and hope. I nodded, the cityscape blurring a bit as my heart started to race. He pulled out a small box from his jacket and opened it to reveal a ring that caught the light just right, sparkling almost as much as his eyes. "Will you marry me, Erica?" Yes, Jake. Absolutely yes. I managed, my voice thick with emotion. And just like that, I was engaged. Engaged to a man who saw me. Really saw me. And loved all the parts of me. Even the ones that were tough as nails. The day I was supposed to meet Jake's parents, my stomach was in knots as Jake drove us up to a sprawling mansion with a driveway longer than my entire apartment block. It hit me. These folks were not just well off. They were loaded. Stepping out of the car, I could feel the weight of the place. The house looked like something out of an old British movie. All brick and ivy with gargoyles staring down like they knew I didn't belong. Jake squeezed my hand as we walked up to the huge oak doors. "You'll be fine, Erica," he whispered, but his voice sounded like he was trying to convince himself too. The doors swung open, and there stood Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove. His suit probably cost more than my rent, and her dress was something you'd see in a magazine. The foyer was massive, with a chandelier overhead that sparkled like a constellation. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-looking folks with titles like Sir and Lady. "Erica, lovely to finally meet you." "I'm Charles, and this is my wife, Eleanor," Mr. Hargrove said, his voice smooth but cool, with a hint of an English accent that sounded practiced. Mrs. Hargrove gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Pleasure to meet you both," I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. As we moved into the dining room, Jake whispered quick tips about which fork to use for what, but his words were a jumble in my head. Dinner was served, and it felt like sitting in a freezer, the air so cold with judgment. Mr. Hargrove pointed to a portrait of a stern-looking man with a thick beard. "That's Sir Reginald Hargrove, a direct ancestor from England. He came over in the 1800s to establish our family here," he said proudly. "Really impressive," I said, trying to sound enthusiastic. But it was hard to eat when you felt like every move was being critiqued. I reached for what I thought was the salad fork, but the silence that followed told me I'd messed up. I glanced at Jake for help, but before he could whisper anything, Mrs. Hargrove's voice cut through. "Perhaps things are done differently where you come from, dear," she said, each word sharp and precise. "Sorry, still getting the hang of all this," I mumbled, my cheeks burning hot. Jake tried to smooth things over, jumping into a story about us, but his parents were more interested in watching my struggle with the dessert spoon next. I felt smaller with each course, their stares heavy on my shoulders. After the icy dinner, we all shuffled into the Hargroves' expansive living room. The plush carpets and heavy curtains made the room feel even more suffocating than the dining hall. I sunk into one of the ornate chairs, feeling like I was an exhibit in a museum about commoners. Mrs. Hargrove, perched elegantly on the edge of her seat, leaned forward. "Erica, dear, tell us more about your family. Your upbringing must have been quite different from ours." I hesitated, feeling Jake's tense gaze on me. "Well, it was mostly just me and my mom. My dad left when I was really young, and I don't remember him much. Mom did everything to raise me on her own. She's a nurse." The room fell deathly silent. Mrs. Hargrove stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wood floor like a scream. "This is unacceptable," she declared, her voice resonating with disgust. "We are descendants of an ancient English lineage. We have standards, traditions. I will not allow my only son to marry someone without pedigree or knowledge of her own lineage." Mr. Hargrove, who had been silently observing the conversation, finally spoke, his words calculated, each one dropping like a weight. "It's essential for us that our family ties are strong and well documented. Erica, can you even name your great-grandparents?" I felt my face heat up, the embarrassment gnawing at me. "I only know about my maternal grandparents," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Hargrove rolled his eyes, a clear sign of contempt. "This is exactly what we feared," he muttered under his breath. Jake finally intervened, his tone firm yet pleading. "Mom, Dad, please. Erica is kind, hardworking, and she loves me. Isn't that what should matter?" His mother's gaze was steely. "Respect and adherence to our family standards are what matter, Jacob. If Erica is to join this family, she must learn our ways. She needs to respect where she is coming from, even if it is nowhere significant." Their words stung, slicing through the warm feelings from earlier in the evening. But Jake was looking at me, his eyes begging me to just go along with it. I nodded reluctantly, agreeing to their terms. "Fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll learn about your family and your traditions." Mrs. Hargrove seemed somewhat placated by my concession. "Good. You'll start by familiarizing yourself with our family tree and understanding who each person in those portraits is. It's not just about names, Erica. It's about respect for our lineage." As they continued talking about their expectations, I felt a part of me shrivel up. The evening had turned from a simple meet and greet into a trial by fire. I had agreed to their demands, yes, but at what cost? As the room filled with discussions of ancestors and noble deeds, I couldn't help but feel alienated from these people, and oddly enough, from the parts of Jake that were tied so tightly to them. The weeks following that stiff dinner were a whirlwind. I barely had time to catch my breath between working my day job and attending the slew of etiquette and style courses that Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove insisted I take. My day started with the buzz of an alarm before sunrise and ended long after the sun had set, leaving me feeling like a zombie. Elbows off the table, Erica, the etiquette instructor, chided gently during one of our sessions. "And remember, the soup spoon moves away from you when you scoop." I nodded, attempting to mirror her movements, but my mind was on a million other things, like the mountain of work waiting for me back at the office and the never-ending wedding plans. "You're doing well," she reassured, her voice soothing. "These things take time to become second nature." I gave her a weak smile. "Thanks. It's a lot, you know." As if on cue, my phone rang. It was Mom. I excused myself and stepped outside to take the call, pressing the phone against my ear while trying to find a quiet corner in the bustling city. "Hi, Mom," I greeted, my voice more tired than I intended. "Erica, darling, how are the wedding preparations going?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement and a hint of concern. I hesitated, not wanting to worry her. "It's all good. Learning a lot. Even picked up how to waltz," I said, trying to keep my tone light. There was a pause, and I knew she wasn't entirely convinced. "You sound exhausted, honey. Are you getting enough rest? You know all this shouldn't be so hard. You need to take care of yourself." I chuckled weakly. "I'll try, Mom, but there's a lot to juggle right now. Etiquette classes, dance lessons, work, and the wedding planning. Just remember what's important, Erica. It's you and Jake at the end of the day, not all these rules and lessons." Her words were a balm, but as soon as we hung up, the weight of reality settled back on my shoulders. I was caught in a tug-of-war between pleasing Jake's parents and maintaining my sanity. Every day felt like a marathon with no finish line in sight. Back inside, I resumed my training, the instructor's voice a droning background noise as I practiced the proper way to hold a wine glass, pinch the stem, not the bowl, apparently. In the rare moments of downtime, I'd find myself staring at the ceiling, wondering if all this was worth it. The constant scrutiny, the endless classes, the cold looks from Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove whenever I slipped up, which was more often than I liked to admit. One evening, as I was about to drift off to sleep, my phone buzzed. It was Jake, his text lighting up the screen. "How was your day? Miss you." I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I wanted to tell him everything, to pour out my frustrations and fears, but I held back. Instead, I typed a simple, "Miss you too." Long day, but all good. As I set the phone down, the silence of my apartment felt overwhelming. Was this how it was going to be? Pushing through the exhaustion, smiling through the stress, all for the sake of fitting into a world that seemed increasingly alien to me. The big day had finally arrived. The venue was a flurry of flowers, fancy dresses, and the faces of the city's high society milling about. My stomach was in knots as I stood in my long, flowing white dress, trying to catch a breath. My mom came over, adjusting a stray curl on my forehead. "Everything will be just fine, Erica," she reassured me with a soft smile. I wanted to believe her, but the minute the ceremony began, any hope of a peaceful wedding evaporated. Jake's parents were on a warpath of superiority. Mr. Hargrove greeted guests with an air of boastfulness, and Mrs. Hargrove was quick to point out to anyone within earshot how they had made everything possible. As the guests settled, I tried to mingle, but Mrs. Hargrove pulled me aside with a frosty smile. "Erica, dear, make sure our friends are taken care of. Fetch some drinks." "There's a good girl," she instructed, gesturing imperiously toward a group of elderly gentlemen discussing politics loudly. But I started, only to be cut off by her sharp glance. "No buts. You're practically family now. Show some initiative," she snapped. Reluctantly, I carried trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres between tables, my dress trailing behind me. The weight of the fabric and the task made me feel more like a servant than a bride. I caught glimpses of Jake laughing and chatting, oblivious to my plight as I passed another round of drinks. I overheard Mrs. Hargrove's voice rise above the chatter. "Erica will be serving us tonight. It's good practice for her, don't you think?" Her tone was condescending, her eyes scanning the crowd for approval. That was the last straw. I approached her, my hands shaking slightly but my voice firm. "I am not a waitress at my own wedding. There are staff here who are supposed to do this." Mrs. Hargrove stood up, her expression one of mock surprise. "You should be grateful we allowed such a simple girl into our family. Remember your place, Erica," she hissed, her words like daggers. I felt a flush of anger rise to my cheeks. "This is my wedding, not a performance for your friends," I retorted, my voice louder than intended. The room fell silent. All eyes were on us now. Jake, catching the tail end of our exchange, stumbled over, a glass of champagne in hand. "What's going on here?" He slurred slightly, his eyes not fully focusing. "Your mother is treating me like a servant at our wedding, Jake. This isn't what today is supposed to be about," I said, frustration boiling over. Jake looked between me and his mother, his expression clouding. "Erica, why are you making a scene? Just do what my mom asks. It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal, Jake. This is our day, and your mom is ruining it." I shot back, disbelief and hurt swirling together. He took a long sip of his champagne before speaking. "Look, Erica, you should be happy I even chose you. There were plenty of girls better than you, prettier, richer. You're making a fuss over nothing." The words stung like a physical slap. I recoiled, the realization hitting me hard. The man I loved, the man I was about to marry, didn't see us as partners. To him, I was just another accessory, something to be molded and fit into the perfect image his parents wanted. As I clutched my bouquet tighter, feeling like I might crumble right there, my mom came over. She took one look at me and wrapped me in her arms, the kind of hug that seemed to hold the world at bay. "Honey, do you love this man? Do you really want to marry him?" she whispered, her voice filled with worry. I shook my head, barely able to muster the voice to speak. "No, Mom. I can't do this. I don't want to." Mom nodded, her jaw setting in that determined way that I knew all too well. She gently took the bouquet from my hands and guided me to a chair, her touch reassuring. Then with surprising sprightliness, she approached the DJ, asked for the microphone, and turned to face the gathered crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please?" Her voice, clear and steady, cut through the murmurs, drawing every eye in the room to her. There was a hush, the kind that precedes a storm. She took a deep breath and turned to face Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove directly. "I have something important to share about truth and pretense," she began, her gaze unwavering. "I went to the same school as Charles and Eleanor Hargrove. Back then, they didn't carry an English accent or boast of noble blood. Their families were hard-working folks, just like ours." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Charles's father was a mechanic, and Eleanor's mother served tables at the local diner. She paused, letting the words sink in. The portraits, the accents, the surname, they bought them all to craft a past that would hide where they really came from. The room erupted into whispers, guests turning to stare at the Hargroves, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. Mrs. Hargrove stood up, her face red, the facade of aristocracy melting away. "That's preposterous." But my mom wasn't finished. "To think that you would stand on these fabrications and look down upon my daughter, judge her worthiness based on a lie. Erica is worth 1,000 of your false titles. She is real, something you've long forgotten how to be." The guests were now openly murmuring, their looks of fascination turning to disdain as they gazed at the Hargroves. Mr. Hargrove tried to speak, his accent slipping into something less refined, more desperate. "We did what we thought was best." "For whom?" My mom cut him off, her voice fierce. "For your son, for society, or just for your own shallow pride?" The confrontation had drawn everyone's attention, and now the room was buzzing, the atmosphere charged with tension and revelations. The Hargroves seemed to shrink, their grandeur dissolving into the air, leaving nothing but the stark, plain truth of their origins. Jake's face twisted with a mix of shock and anger. He stormed up to me, his voice barely a hiss, as he leaned close. "You've ruined everything, Erica. You've disgraced my family. And now you're questioning if I want to marry you after this spectacle." His words stung, but before I could respond, he grabbed my arm, pulling me slightly closer. "I'll teach you how to be a good wife, one who knows her place and obeys." His threat hung in the air, heavy and chilling. I pulled my arm back with all my might, stepping away from him. The room was dead silent now, everyone's eyes on us. This was the man I had intended to marry. This was the family I was about to join. No, this couldn't be my life. I took a deep breath, my mother's earlier strength flowing through me. "There will be no wedding," I announced loudly, making sure every guest heard. I regret that I ever considered marrying someone who truly matches the arrogance and deceit of his parents. Murmurs filled the room, some of shock, others of support. Jake stood there, mouth agape, as if trying to catch the words and stuff them back into my mouth. My mother came to my side, her presence a comforting shield against the chaos. Together, we walked through the crowd, our heads held high. In the weeks that followed, news of the Hargroves' disgrace spread through the city. Their fabricated lineage and high society standing crumbled like a house of cards in a breeze. People who once revered them now crossed the street to avoid their shame. They sold their mansion and moved away, seeking a fresh start where their past wouldn't haunt them. As for Jake, I heard bits and pieces, rumors of a downward spiral, of nights spent at bars trying to drink away the scandal. I didn't know if they were true, and frankly, I didn't care to know. He had shown his true colors, and they were too dark and twisted for me ever to want to look back. "Thank you, Mom," I said to her one evening as we sat in our modest living room, a stark contrast to the opulent falsity I had almost married into. For everything. For being there, for standing up for me, for helping me see the truth before it was too late. She took my hand, squeezing it gently. "I'll always be here, Erica. You're my daughter, and I raised you to be strong and true. No man, no family can ever make you less than what you are." We sat there, the TV chattering in the background, a normalcy that felt refreshing. I had lost a fiancé, but gained back my life, my self-respect, and, more importantly, my future. After the whole wedding debacle, going back to work felt like walking into a sanctuary. My colleagues, who had heard about the chaos, were nothing short of supportive. "Erica, you've dodged a bullet, girl," Marco said as soon as I walked into the office. He was leaning against my desk, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, which he handed to me as a peace offering or maybe a welcome-back gift. "Thanks, Marco. Feels good to be back," I replied, taking the coffee and savoring the familiar bitter warmth. And yeah, that bullet was more like a cannonball. Anyone who makes you serve guests at your own wedding is no husband material. "You deserve way better, hun," Jenny chimed in from her cubicle across the way. I smiled, grateful for the camaraderie. "I think so too. It's nice to be back where I'm appreciated for what I do, not for the family I might have married into." As the days turned into weeks, the support from my team didn't waver. It was during this healing time that I met Brian. He was a friend of a friend, nothing fancy about his background, just a genuine guy with a quick smile and an easygoing attitude that was infectious. We met at a small get-together. It was low-key, just a few friends hanging out on a Saturday afternoon. He was there laughing at something silly when I walked in. "Hey, you must be Erica," he said, standing up to greet me. "I've heard a lot about you. All good things, I promise." "Thanks, Brian. I hope they didn't embellish too much," I replied, trying to match his easy demeanor. We hit it off instantly. His family was the polar opposite of the Hargroves. The first time I met his parents, they welcomed me with warm hugs and genuine smiles. "Erica, we're just glad Brian found someone who makes him so happy," his mom said, pulling me into a hug as soon as I stepped through their front door. It was refreshing, the simplicity of it all. No pretenses, no demands, just mutual respect and acceptance, Brian, and I weren't rushing anything. We were taking our time getting to know each other beyond the surface level. Back at work, my boss called me into his office one day. "Erica, I just want to say we've all noticed how you've handled everything. It's not been easy, but you've managed to keep your performance top-notch." I nodded, unsure where this was leading. "We think it's time for another promotion. You've proven you can handle just about anything, and your leadership has never wavered." Leaving his office, I felt a surge of pride. With a new relationship developing, a career on the rise, and the respect of those I cared about, I was finally in a place where I felt I belonged. I am Elizabeth. I have worked in my parents' tableware store for as long as I can remember. We have all kinds of goods, from fancy plates to drinking vessels for your morning wake-up. This is truly a family affair. It was just an ordinary day until the morning when Mrs. Wilson from the bakery next door marched into our store in a right fury. She always had this way of busting in like she was the owner. "Chon," she screamed without even leaving that store. 3 words, "I want you." Her voice could slit concrete. I was busy shuffling some new ceramic teapots when I stopped to see what the messengers were up to. Dad wiped his hands on his apron and shot me a look that said, "Here we go again." "Sure thing, Beverly. What's stirring?" Dad always tried to stay cheerful around her, but you could tell he was bracing himself. Mrs. Wilson glanced around, her eyes finally landing on me. "This is family business, Elizabeth. Mind giving us a minute?" Her tone rubbed me the wrong way, but I shrugged it off and wandered over to the other side of the store, pretending to fix an already perfect display of dinner sets. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but their voices carried over the shelves. "I'll cut to the chase, John. My bakery and your store have been neighbors for years. It's time we think bigger. What do you say to merging our businesses?" Her voice was all business, serious. Dad coughed a little, taken aback. "Merge, huh? That's a hefty suggestion, Beverly. What's got this idea in your head now?" "Not just that," she continued, lowering her voice so I had to strain to hear. "I think our kids could make this even more beneficial. If Elizabeth and Lucas were to tie the knot, it would solidify the deal." I almost dropped a teapot. Marry Lucas? The Lucas I knew was her son. Sure, but he was 10 years older than me, and we barely exchanged 2 words despite being neighbors. I peeked around the aisle and saw Dad scratching his head, clearly in deep thought. "Lucas is a good lad, and Elizabeth's a bright girl," Dad finally said. "But marriage, they hardly know each other." "Beverly, they'll get along, trust me. Plus, it makes good business sense, doesn't it?" There was a sharpness in her voice, like she was used to getting her way. Dad nodded slowly. "I'll talk it over with the Miss and Elizabeth, of course." When Mrs. Wilson left, Dad called me over. "Elizabeth, you heard all that, didn't you?" I nodded, not sure what to make of it. "She wants to merge the store and the bakery, and she wants me to marry Lucas." "Yeah," Dad sighed, rubbing his temples. "What do you think?" I know it's a lot to take in. Marrying for business sounded like something out of an old movie, not something I'd ever imagined for myself. I don't know, Dad. Lucas seems nice, but marry him just like that. You should meet him properly this time, see if you two click. No pressure to decide right now. We'll take this step by step." Lucas and I spent the next few months getting to know each other. I found that he wasn't just well-mannered. He had a genuine side to him that cared about the business as much as his mother did, but in a less overbearing way. Our conversations often drifted from business to personal, which made the whole situation seem less like a contract and more like a potential relationship. The wedding planning, though, was a whole other beast. Mrs. Wilson, my soon-to-be mother-in-law, took over everything from the cake from her bakery to the decorations that looked like they belonged in one of her display windows. One afternoon, as we were going over the guest list, she barged into the room with a stack of invitations so thick you'd think we were summoning the whole town. "Elizabeth, dear, I've added a few names to your guest list. People important to our business. It's crucial they're there," she announced, dropping the stack on the table with a thud that made me jump. I bit my tongue, not wanting to start a fight. Lucas saw this and squeezed my hand under the table. "We'll sort it out, Robbie. It's our day, remember?" The day of the wedding was a blur. I stood at the back of the hall in my dress, feeling more like a prop in Mrs. Wilson's grand business scheme than a bride. My dad came up to me, his smile a little forced. "You look beautiful, Elizabeth." "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm. I nodded, taking a deep breath. "Let's do this." The ceremony went by in a rush, and before I knew it, Lucas and I were pronounced husband and wife. The reception was loud, filled with Mrs. Wilson's guests who talked more about the potential of our joint ventures than our nuptials. The merger was completed soon after the wedding. Both shops were knocked into one big space, with a section for the bakery and another for the tableware. The first day we opened the combined store, Mrs. Wilson was everywhere, directing staff like a general. Elizabeth dear, make sure those plates are aligned with the pastries. Symmetry sells, she called out across the store. I adjusted the plates, trying to follow her exacting standards. Lucas was in the bakery section, trying to coordinate with the bakers. Make sure those scones are fresh. Elizabeth, how's it going over there? He shouted over the noise, trying to keep up with your mom's symmetry mantra. I shouted back, a hint of frustration in my voice, trying to keep up with your mom's symmetry mantra. But as weeks turned into months, the workload only got heavier. Between running the front of the store, helping in the bakery, and all the paperwork, I found myself unable to keep up with my college classes. Elizabeth, you're running a business now. You won't need that degree. This is your life. Mrs. Wilson declared one evening, her tone dismissive, as if the matter was already decided. Her words, sharp and final, hit me harder than I expected. Living with them was supposed to save us money and make managing the business easier, she argued. It just meant longer hours for me. Since we were just a short walk from the store, the lack of personal space and constant oversight from Mrs. Wilson suffocated me, making each day harder than the last. What started as a partnership increasingly felt like a takeover. Meanwhile, I noticed something else that troubled me more than I expected. My dad was around less and less. One particularly busy Tuesday morning, as I was setting up the store before opening, I couldn't help but feel the emptiness of his absence. It used to be that he'd be here by now, sharing a joke or two to kick off the day. Instead, it was just me and the clinking of ceramics. That evening, after a long day of dealing with customers and Mrs. Wilson's incessant directions, I visited my parents. The air in their living room felt heavier than usual, like there were words hanging in it that no one dared to speak. "Dad, why aren't you at the store much anymore?" I asked as soon as I sat down. The direct approach felt necessary. My dad looked up, a frown creasing his forehead. "Well, Elizabeth, it's complicated. Beverly has, well, she's taken over more than we expected." My mom chimed in from across the room, her voice sharp with worry. "She's pushed your father out, Elizabeth. That contract we signed, it wasn't just a merger. It's like we handed her the keys to the kingdom." My stomach twisted into knots. "What do you mean, Dad? You've always handled the orders and the suppliers." He sighed, his hands clasped tightly together. "Not anymore. Beverly rewrote the job roles legally. I'm just a consultant now. Barely that. I don't have a say in the business I built." Anger flared up inside me, hot and fierce. "Why didn't you say anything? We thought we could handle it, sort it out without worrying you," my mom said, her eyes sad. "But it's clear we can't. She's taking everything we've worked for, Elizabeth." The next day, I confronted Mrs. Wilson. It was early, just as the morning light began spilling into the store. She was arranging some pastries, her back to me as I walked in. "Mrs. Wilson, we need to talk about my dad," I said, my voice firm, louder than I intended. She turned around, her expression one of mock surprise. "Oh, what about him, dear?" "You know what I'm talking about. You're pushing him out of his own business. Why are you doing this?" I demanded. Mrs. Wilson straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron as she faced me. "Elizabeth, your father is getting older. He can't handle the stress of the business. It's better for everyone that this way. I'm making things more efficient." "That's not your call to make," I shot back. "He built this place. You can't just sideline him because you think it's better." She scoffed, shaking her head. "Business is tough, Elizabeth. It's not about sentimental value. It's about keeping the ship afloat. I'm doing what's necessary." When the pandemic hit, it felt like someone had pulled the floor out from under us. Sales at the store plummeted. Every day, the empty aisles stared back at me, a grim reminder that things were bad and might get worse. It was during one of those quiet, worrying shifts that I decided we couldn't just sit around waiting for normal to return. Lucas, we have to pivot to online. We can set up delivery, maybe start taking individual orders, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Lucas looked skeptical but nodded. It's worth a shot. Let's talk to Mom about it. I knew convincing Mrs. Wilson would be an uphill battle. She had her way set in stone and viewed online sales as a risky venture. True to form, when we brought it up, she dismissed it outright. We're not some tech startup. We're a brick-and-mortar business. We'll wait this out, she declared, cutting off any further discussion. But I couldn't just stand by and watch everything we'd built crumble to dust. So I started something on the down low. After hours, I used our store's resources to build an online community. I sold dishes from the store and took to baking cakes after the bakery closed for the day. Orders began to trickle in, then flood. Keeping this from Lucas and Mrs. Wilson was exhausting. I was burning the candle at both ends, managing our secret online sales and my day job at the store. Nights turned into mornings, and I found myself sneaking back home well past midnight on many occasions. One night, as I tiptoed in, trying not to wake anyone, I found Mrs. Wilson waiting in the living room, her arms folded and her face a mix of anger and disappointment. "Where have you been, Elizabeth? Look at the state of this house," she snapped, her voice low but fierce. "I've been working, Mrs. Wilson. We got a rush of online orders tonight," I replied, my voice weary from too many long nights. "Online orders? What online orders?" Her voice rose, sharp and accusing. Before I could explain, Lucas came down, drawn by the noise. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked. "Ask your wife what's going on. She's running some secret side business and neglecting her duties around here." Mrs. Wilson shot back, glaring at me. Lucas turned to me, confusion and frustration written all over his face. What's she talking about?" I sighed, the fatigue of the last few weeks catching up to me. "I started an online store. It's been keeping us afloat since the pandemic started. I didn't tell you because your mom said no, and I didn't think she'd go for it." Lucas rubbed his temples, looking between his mom and me. "You should have told me, Elizabeth. And you." He turned to his mom, should have been more open to her ideas. Mrs. Wilson's face hardened. "This is my house, and while you're under my roof, you'll follow my rules, both of you." The argument spiraled from there. Lucas, usually my ally, sided with his mom this time. "Elizabeth, you need to balance your time better. Help out more around here." Defeated and heartbroken that Lucas didn't see how hard I was trying to save our business, I cut back on the online orders. I started spending my mornings cleaning the house instead of preparing shipments or baking. My afternoons were spent running the pastry counter, a reminder of what I had to scale back on to keep peace in the house. It was a dreary, rain-soaked afternoon, and I was straightening up the store hall when the door creaked open. A little girl, about 8 years old, stumbled in. Her clothes were drenched, sticking to her skin, and she was crying, her face streaked with tears. I rushed over to her, setting aside the stack of plates. I was arranging. "Hey there, what happened? Are you okay?" I asked, trying to sound as gentle as I could. Before she could answer, Mrs. Wilson spotted us from the end of the aisle. She marched over, her lips pressed into a thin line. "What is this, Elizabeth? We don't have time for this today. She looks like a beggar. Put her out before others see." My stomach twisted at her words. She's just a child, Mrs. Wilson. She's clearly lost and needs help. Lucas came over, having overheard his mother. His face was unreadable as he glanced at the girl, then back at me. Elizabeth, Mom's right. We can't have kids like her running into the store. It's not good for business. Just handle it, okay? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Lucas, she's scared and alone. We can't just throw her back out into the rain. Ignoring them both, I took the girl to a chair and wrapped her in a clean blanket from the back room. I made her a cup of hot chocolate, hoping to calm her down a bit. Mrs. Wilson was fuming. This is exactly the kind of distraction we don't need. Elizabeth, you're responsible for any fallout from this. The girl managed to calm down enough to tell me her name was Sophie. She had wandered off from a park nearby and gotten lost. Just as she started to relax, the police arrived. They thanked me for looking after Sophie and told me her parents had been frantically looking for her. It turns out she wasn't far from home after all. After the police and Sophie left, Mrs. Wilson pulled me aside, her face stern and cold. Because of your little stunt, I'm finding you. You took time away from your work to deal with this situation. You'll wash dishes for the next 2 days to make up for it. Lucas just nodded along with whatever his mom said, not standing up for me. It stung more than I expected. That night, as I scrubbed pot after pot, my mind raced. I felt more like a servant than a part of the family. Lucas's support had always been my rock, but now he was just another weight dragging me down. Each harsh word from Mrs. Wilson, each nod of agreement from Lucas, was a reminder of how trapped I felt. It was another ordinary morning at the store when this richly dressed man walked in, looking around like he was searching for something special. I greeted him and asked if I could help him find anything. He nodded and explained he was looking for a high-end tea set. I showed him our finest collection, and he seemed impressed, selecting one of our most expensive sets. While I wrapped up his purchase, he browsed our pastry section and picked out an assortment of treats. The whole time, he had this kind demeanor about him, making small talk and asking about the store's history. After ringing up his purchases, he thanked me and then paused, his expression turning a bit more serious. By the way, I'm not sure if you remember, but my daughter was the little girl you helped out last week, the one who got lost in the storm. I was taken aback, not expecting this twist. Of course I remember. She was such a brave little girl. I'm glad I could help her. He smiled warmly and handed me his business card. Well, I'm really grateful for what you did. If you ever need anything, advice or help with anything at all, just give me a call. I looked at the card and noticed he was a lawyer, Mr. Hayes. That caught my attention, considering the mess with the store and the merger. Actually, there might be something. Could we maybe talk about a legal matter? It's about the business my father used to own with my mother-in-law. Of course, he replied with an encouraging nod. Why don't you come by my office next week? We can go over everything in detail. I took him up on his offer, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. At his office, I handed him the pile of documents my dad had signed years ago, the ones that merged our family store with my mother-in-law's bakery. He went through them carefully, his brow furrowing more with each page. After a long silence, Mr. Hayes looked up. There are several significant issues here. The contract has multiple violations that are quite concerning. I think we have a strong case if you want to challenge this. He offered to help me pro bono to make things right. I was overwhelmed but grateful. Thank you. I'd like that. It's just hard, you know. It's my husband's family, too. He understood my hesitation. It's not just about business. It's about your life. You deserve to have control over that, and you're not alone in this fight. I left his office feeling a mix of hope and dread. Could I really go against my husband and his mother? But then, what was the alternative? Living under Mrs. Wilson's thumb, watching the store my parents built from scratch being mismanaged. I walked into our house that evening, my mind still spinning from my meeting with the lawyer. I wasn't prepared for the scene that greeted me. The place was bustling, filled with guests laughing and talking, glasses clinking. I paused, taking it all in, when my mother-in-law, slightly tipsy, spotted me. "There you are, wandering the streets when you should be here serving your guests," she bellowed across the room. "It's your anniversary, Elizabeth. Have you no sense of duty?" I froze. My anniversary had completely slipped my mind amidst the chaos of recent events. "I'm sorry, I forgot," I stammered, feeling every eye in the room turn towards me. My apology did nothing to soothe her. In a fit of anger, she grabbed a nearby pizza box and hurled it at me. The box grazed my shoulder before tumbling to the ground. "Useless, absolutely useless," she shouted, her face red with fury. Before I could recover, Lucas, also showing signs of having had too much to drink, stumbled over to me. "Look at you, not even ready to eat. Wash up for heaven's sake," he slurred, tossing wine from his glass onto my hands and clothes in a mocking gesture. The wine stained my shirt, dripping cold and unwelcome against my skin. Something inside me snapped. The humiliation, the disrespect, the sheer injustice of how they were treating me. It all boiled over. I wiped my hands on my stained shirt and faced the room. My voice was steady and loud enough to silence the room. "I've been to a lawyer. I am getting a divorce, Lucas." The room fell completely silent. Lucas and his mother looked at me as if they had seen a ghost. "Who do you think you are?" My mother-in-law hissed, stepping closer. "You think you can just—" "I'm not finished." I cut her off, my voice ringing clear. "I'm challenging the merger of the store. There's been fraud, and I've already sent the documents to the authorities and to court." Lucas staggered slightly, his earlier bravado fading. "Elizabeth, you can't mean this." "I am also seeking financial compensation for everything I've endured here," I continued, ignoring his disbelief. The shock was palpable. Murmurs started to rise among the guests as my declaration sank in. I didn't wait for more questions or for the situation to escalate further. I turned on my heel and headed upstairs to pack my things. My mother-in-law followed, her tone shifting to desperation. "Elizabeth, please, let's talk about this. You're overreacting." I stopped, turned, and faced her one last time. Without a word, I handed her the lawyer's business card. "From now on, any communication goes through my lawyer," I said firmly. With that, I went to our room, my hand shaking but my resolve firm. I packed quickly, only essentials, only what I needed to start anew. I finally moved out of my mother-in-law's house and into a small apartment across town. It felt like breathing fresh air for the first time in years. I was on my own now, but I wasn't alone. My dad was with me, and together we were fighting to take back what was rightfully ours. My lawyer, Mr. Hayes, worked tirelessly on our case. He was a bulldog in the courtroom, fighting against the fraudulent merger my mother-in-law had orchestrated years ago. It wasn't long before we received the news we had been hoping for. The court ruled in our favor. They found Mrs. Wilson guilty of fraud and overturned the merger. Additionally, they imposed a hefty fine on her and awarded me financial compensation. The compensation was just enough to buy out her share in the business, a combined baker and tableware store that my dad and I once ran together. It felt surreal to stand in front of the shop now, fully ours again without the shadow of Mrs. Wilson looming over us. "Dad, we did it. It's ours again," I said, handing him the new keys to the store. We spent the next few weeks renovating the store, making it ours again. Every new coat of paint, Every display rearranged felt like reclaiming a piece of my soul that I had lost. Mrs. Wilson and Lucas were forced to find other jobs. The court costs and the fine took everything they had saved. I heard rumors about their struggles, but I kept my distance. Lucas tried to reach out once or twice, but I didn't respond. That part of my life was closed. I was focused on the future now. With the store back under our control, I resumed my college studies. I enrolled in night classes, determined to finish my degree. Sitting in a classroom again, I felt hope, a stark contrast to the despair I had felt under Mrs. Wilson's roof. One evening, after closing the shop, my dad and I sat at one of the tables, sharing a pot of coffee. You know, Elizabeth, starting over like this, it's more than I could have asked for, Dad said, looking around the shop fondly. I feel the same, Dad. It's like I finally woke up from a long, bad dream. We have a second chance here, and I'm not going to waste it, I replied, feeling a strength in my words that I hadn't felt in years. We talked about plans for the future, new products we could introduce, holiday sales to prepare for, and community events we could sponsor. It was exciting, invigorating, and I loved every minute of it. My name is Brenda Collins. At 29 years old, I have a job at the local library in an obscure small town that more than likely no one embodies any knowledge of. My life is easy, maybe too boring for some, but it's mine. I was always a quiet one, for whom voices of the world outside were often too loud. The library is my sanctuary. The floors creak and the shelves are banged up. It's an old small building, but to me, I'd like to think it's spotless. I open up the library at 8 o'clock each morning to light, and that smoky smell of well-loved books. A routine that never becomes tiresome. My parents passed away when I was young, so I was raised by my grandmother. She was a kind woman, always encouraging me to read and learn. But she's gone now too, and I'm all alone. No siblings, no close relatives, just me and my small world. Good morning, Brenda. Mr. Jenkins, a regular visitor, greets me as he walks in. He's an elderly man who spends his days reading history books. Good morning, Mr. Jenkins. The new shipment of history books arrived yesterday. I set them aside for you. I reply with a smile. Ah, you know me too well, dear, he chuckles, shuffling towards the designated shelf. The day goes on like this, with familiar faces coming and going. I help a group of kids find books for their school project, recommend a romance novel to Mrs. Harrison, and guide Mr. Thompson to the science fiction section. It's a quiet life, but I like it. I find comfort in the predictability, the routine. And then one day, everything changed. The day Jack walked into my life. He came in looking for a book, but I could tell he wasn't the regular library type. He seemed out of place with his crisp suit and confident stride. Can you help me find a book? He asked, his voice smooth and inviting. Of course. What are you looking for? I replied, trying to keep my composure. It's a novel, The Great Gatsby. I believe, he said. Right this way, I said, leading him to the classics section. As I handed him the book, our hands brushed briefly, sending a jolt through me. It was a simple touch, but it lingered in my mind. Thank you, Brenda, he said, reading my name tag. I'm Jack. It's nice to meet you. Jack, I replied. That brief encounter marked the beginning of everything. The beginning of a love that I thought would last a lifetime. The beginning of a journey that would take me from the quiet life I knew into a world of chaos and betrayal. If only I had known then what I know now. Maybe things would have been different. But life doesn't come with a warning label, and sometimes we just have to learn the hard way. After that first meeting, Jack began to visit the library more frequently. It was odd, considering he didn't strike me as the reading type. But every time he came in, he'd ask for a book recommendation and then spend a few minutes chatting with me. One day, he walked in just as I was struggling with a box of newly arrived books. "Need a hand with that?" he offered, walking over. "That would be great, thanks," I said. As we placed the books on the shelves, he asked, "So, Brenda, what got you into working at a library?" I shrugged. "I've always loved books. They're like friends, you know. Plus, it's nice and quiet here." He laughed. "I can see that. It's like a whole different world." Our conversations grew longer with each visit. I found out that Jack worked in his family's business, something to do with real estate. He was easy to talk to, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was genuinely interested in me. Then one day, he surprised me. "Brenda, would you like to have dinner with me tonight?" he asked, a hopeful look in his eyes. I was taken aback. "Like a date?" "Yes, like a date," he smiled. I hesitated. This was new territory for me, but there was something about him that made me want to say yes. "Okay, sure. I'd like that," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. We went to a small restaurant in town. It wasn't fancy, but it was cozy. We talked about everything and nothing, and for a few hours, I forgot about my usually solitary life. Walking home, Jack said, "I had a really great time tonight, Brenda. You're very different from the people I usually meet." I didn't know how to respond, so I just smiled. He continued, "I'd like to see you again. Would that be okay?" I nodded. Yes, I'd like that. From then on, we started seeing each other more regularly. He'd take me out to dinner, or we'd go for walks. It was nice. For once, I felt like I was part of something more, part of a world that wasn't just about books and quietness. It wasn't long before I fell for him hard. He was charming and attentive, and he made me feel special. And when he proposed, I didn't hesitate. I said yes. Looking back, I wish I had seen the signs. I wish I had known that the charm was just a mask, a cover for something much less pleasant. But love has a way of blinding you, of making you ignore the warning signs, and I was very much in love, or at least I thought I was. After Jack and I got engaged, things started to change. It began with his parents. They didn't approve of me from the start. They thought I was below their son because I didn't come from money. The first time I met them, it was clear they didn't like me. We were at their house for dinner, and I was nervous. It was a big, fancy house, nothing like what I was used to. "Brenda, this is my mother, Margaret, and my father, Richard," Jack introduced. "Nice to meet you," I said, trying to smile. Margaret looked me up and down. So you're the girl who works at the library." "Yes, I am," I replied, feeling smaller by the second. Richard chimed in, "Jack, couldn't you find someone more suitable?" I felt like crawling into a hole. The dinner was long and uncomfortable. They made it clear they thought I wasn't good enough for their son, but Jack stood up for me, which made me love him even more. Before our wedding, they insisted on a prenuptial agreement. They said it was just a formality. I didn't have much to lose, so I agreed without making a fuss. Once we got married, I moved into Jack's house, which was actually his parents' house. They had given it to him as a wedding gift, but they acted like it was still theirs. His parents came over all the time, unannounced. They'd walk in and start ordering me around. "Brenda, make us some coffee," Margaret would demand as soon as she walked in, and I would, without saying anything. I didn't want to cause trouble. One day, Margaret pointed at the TV and said, "Remember, Brenda, in case of divorce, you can't claim this." It was like that with everything. They reminded me constantly that everything in the house wasn't mine. Jack started changing too. He wasn't the man I fell in love with. He started joining in on the jokes his parents made about me. One evening, I was trying to decide what to wear for a family event. I asked Jack for his opinion. "This one makes you look less drab," he said, laughing. I was hurt. It was like he was a different person around his parents. He didn't stand up for me anymore. Instead, he laughed along with them. It was exhausting living in that house. I felt like an outsider, an unwanted guest. I kept hoping things would get better, but they only got worse. The stress got to me. I started having stomach pains, bad ones. I tried to ignore them, but one day I collapsed at the library. I woke up in the hospital. The doctor said it was stress-related. I was in the hospital for a few days. Jack didn't visit. He didn't even call. I felt so alone. Then one day, a notary came to my room. He had news. My great-aunt, someone I barely remembered, had passed away, and she had left me her fortune, $30 million. I couldn't believe it. I didn't even know what to do with that kind of money, but suddenly I wasn't just the poor girl from the library anymore. When Jack and his parents found out, they came to visit. Suddenly, they were all smiles and sweetness. "Darlings, we're so happy for you," Margaret said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Yes, we're a family. We should support each other," Richard added. I didn't buy it. It was too much of a change. After they left, I overheard them talking outside my room. They didn't know I was listening. "She's such a fool. Can you believe our luck?" Jack laughed. "We need to make sure she doesn't leave you, Jack. Maybe you should have a child with her." "That will tie her down," Margaret suggested. I felt sick to my stomach. These people didn't care about me. They just wanted my money. I knew then what I had to do. I had to get out of that house, away from these people. I had to take control of my life. I wasn't going to be their victim anymore. I left the hospital with a plan in my mind. I knew what I had to do. As I got home, Jack and his parents were waiting. They were all smiles, acting like the caring family they never were. "Oh, Brenda, we were so worried about you," Margaret exclaimed. I nodded but didn't say much. I needed to act normal, not to tip them off. Jack came closer. "So when do you get the inheritance?" he asked a little too eagerly. I looked at him, the man I thought I loved, and realized I didn't even recognize him anymore. "Soon," I said, "but it's not something you need to worry about." His smile faltered a bit. "But we're married, Brenda. What's yours is mine, right?" I forced a smile. "Of course, darling." That night, I couldn't sleep. Their voices echoed in my head, their fake concern, their greed. It made me sick. I got up and started writing. I wrote down everything they had done, everything they had said. It was like a dam had broken and years of pent-up frustration and pain poured out. The next morning, I had a meeting with a lawyer. I explained everything, showed him the prenuptial agreement. He was shocked but said the agreement would protect me. "You're doing the right thing," he assured me. When I got back, I found Jack and his parents in the living room. They looked up as I walked in. "There she is, our brave girl," Richard said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I sat down, clutching my purse. "I have something to say." They all looked at me, curious. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, my voice steady. The room went silent. Silent, then Margaret erupted. "What? You ungrateful little—" Jack was on his feet. "Brenda, you can't be serious. We love you." "Do you, Jack? Because I don't feel loved. I feel used." Margaret was fuming. "We'll sue you. We'll take half of your inheritance." I reached into my purse and pulled out a copy of the prenuptial agreement. "Actually, you can't." This says neither of us can claim the other's property in case of divorce." They were speechless. For the first time, I felt in control. I stood up. "I'm leaving. I don't want any of you to contact me." I walked out of that house, their shouts and insults trailing behind me. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but as I drove away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I was free from their disdain, their manipulation. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew it had to be better than the past. I rented a small apartment in the city. It was nothing fancy, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. I was still dealing with a divorce, but I felt like I could handle it. One day, I got a call from the lawyer. "Brenda, there's something you should know about your great-aunt's will." I was puzzled. "What about it?" "There's a condition. You need to use a portion of your inheritance for a charitable cause. It was your great-aunt's final wish." I was surprised. I had no idea. The lawyer continued. She was quite the philanthropist. It seemed she wanted to pass that on to you. I hung up the phone, deep in thought. My great-aunt had given me a chance to do something good. It felt like a sign, a push in a new direction. I started researching charities and causes. I wanted to do something meaningful, something that would make a difference. That's when I stumbled upon a small organization that helped women who were victims of domestic abuse. It struck a chord with me. I contacted them and set up a meeting. The woman I met, Linda, was passionate and dedicated. "We provide shelter, legal aid, and counseling to women who have nowhere else to go," Linda explained. I listened. Moved by the stories she shared, I wanted to help. I said, feeling a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. With Linda's guidance, I used a part of the inheritance to fund a new shelter. It was an incredible feeling, knowing I was helping other women find a way out, just like I had. A few weeks later, Linda invited me to the opening of the shelter. It was a small event, but the atmosphere was full of hope and gratitude. As people mingled, I noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was Sarah, an old colleague from the library. "Brenda, is that you?" she asked, surprised. "Sarah, it's been so long," I said, hugging her. "What are you doing here?" she asked. I told her about the shelter and my involvement. She listened, her eyes wide. "That's incredible, Brenda. I had no idea," she said. "It's a new chapter for me," I said, smiling. We spent the evening catching up. It felt good to reconnect with an old friend. It felt like pieces of my life were slowly falling back into place. As the event wrapped up, Linda came over. "Brenda, I can't thank you enough. This shelter will change lives," she said. I looked around at the faces of the women who now had a safe place to go. "It's the least I could do," I said, feeling a warmth in my heart that I hadn't felt in a very long time. The days started to blend into one another, each filled with the rewarding work at the shelter. I was finding a new sense of purpose, something that was truly mine. Then out of the blue, my phone rang. It was a number I hadn't seen in a while. Jack. My heart raced with a mixture of emotions, but curiosity prevailed. "Hello, Jack," I said, my voice calm. "Brenda, I need to talk to you. Can we meet? It's urgent." His voice sounded desperate. Reluctantly, I agreed to meet him at a public coffee shop, hoping that being in a familiar place would give me strength. Sitting across from Jack, he looked different, defeated, almost pitiful. His eyes were pleading. "Brenda, I made a huge mistake. I want you back." "I've realized how much you mean to me," he blurted out. I looked at him, feeling nothing but contempt. "Why now, Jack?" I asked. He sighed. "My parents, they controlled everything. They were the reason our marriage failed. I was weak, but I'm different now. I felt a surge of anger. You blame your parents. You stood by while they treated me like dirt. You laughed with them. Jack reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Please, Brenda. I know I was wrong. I've changed. I stared at him, seeing the man I once loved, but now felt nothing for. Changed or not, it's too late. I feel nothing for you, Jack. Nothing but contempt. His face fell, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the man I married, but it was fleeting. I'm sorry, Jack. I've moved on. I have a life now, a purpose. There's no place for you in it, I said firmly. He nodded slowly, a look of resignation on his face. I understand. I just had to try. Leaving the coffee shop, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was over. Truly over. The next day, there was an event at the shelter. A local artist had donated a sculpture, and it was to be unveiled in the garden. As I stood there, surrounded by people who supported and believed in me, I felt a sense of belonging. Sarah, my old colleague from the library, stood beside me. You've done something amazing here, Brenda, she said, smiling. The artist pulled the cover off the sculpture, a figure of a woman reaching up to the sky. It symbolized hope, strength, and new beginnings. Applause filled the air, and for a moment, everything felt right in the world. Linda, the woman who had helped me so much, came over. Brenda, this is just the beginning. There's so much more we can do. I looked around at the faces filled with hope and knew she was right. This was my new beginning, and I was ready to embrace it fully. My new life was busy and fulfilling. Every day at the shelter brought new challenges and rewards. My confidence grew, and for the first time in years, I felt in control of my destiny. I even started taking self-defense classes, something I would have never imagined doing before. One day, as I was leaving the shelter, I saw a car parked outside. It was my mother-in-law, Margaret, and she stepped out as soon as she saw me. Brenda, we need to talk, she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard. I have nothing to say to you, Margaret, I replied, my voice steady. Please just hear me out. I've realized how wrong we were, she pleaded. I stopped and looked at her. She seemed genuine, but I couldn't forget the past. What do you want, Margaret? I asked. I want to apologize. I treated you terribly. I've lost my son because of it, and I don't want to lose you too. You were like the daughter I never had, she said, her eyes glistening with tears. I felt a pang of something, sympathy, perhaps, but I pushed it away. Margaret, you made my life a living hell. An apology won't change that. I've moved on, and I suggest you do the same, I said firmly. She reached out to me, but I stepped back. Please, Brenda. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to make things right. I shook my head. It's too late for that. Goodbye, Margaret. As I walked away, I felt her gaze on my back, but I didn't look back. I had learned to stand up for myself, and there was no going back to the way things were. The next day, I received a letter from Jack's lawyer. He was contesting the divorce settlement. I wasn't surprised, but I was ready. I met with my lawyer, a sharp woman named Rachel. He's got no leg to stand on, Brenda. The prenuptial agreement is clear. He's just trying to intimidate you, she said confidently. I nodded. I'm not afraid of him anymore. Let's fight this. The court date arrived, and I walked in with my head held high. Jack was there with his lawyer, and for a moment, our eyes met. There was a flash of the old Jack, the one I had loved, but it vanished quickly. The judge listened to both sides and then made her decision. The prenuptial agreement stood, and Jack's claims were dismissed. I felt a surge of relief and triumph. After the court session, Jack approached me. Brenda, I'm sorry. "I was wrong," he said, his voice low. I looked at him, seeing the man I once loved, but now felt nothing for. "Goodbye, Jack. Take care of yourself," I said and walked away. As I left the courtroom, I felt a sense of closure. That chapter of my life was finally over, and a new one was just beginning. At the shelter, we were planning a fundraiser, and it was taking all my attention. The support from the community was overwhelming, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude. The night of the fundraiser arrived, and the place was buzzing with energy. People from all walks of life had come to support our cause. As I looked around, I realized how far I had come, from a quiet, timid woman to someone who stood up for herself and others. "Brenda, you did it." "This is amazing," Sarah said, coming up to me. I smiled. We did it, and there's so much more to do. As the event went on, I felt a sense of accomplishment and purpose. This was my life now, and I was exactly where I was meant to be.